West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
You covered up my readings.
Oh, all right.
Covered up. I had the last page. Oh, it's probably
Oh, it's
underneath
back
your
here.
book.
My apologies.
That's where it is. Okay, thank you. We had a wonderful vantage point up here, looking down at everybody sort of going to the music. It's almost like being in a church revival. You just can't help but move to that music, can you? It's good. We have 3 readings today. The first reading is by Maria Popova in the Marginalian. A challenge arises when we make something over a long period of time. As we evolve, as we add experiences, impressions, memories, deepening knowledge and self-knowledge to the combinatorial pool from which all creative work springs, what we make evolves accordingly. It must, if we are living widely and wisely enough. Eventually, the name we once chose for it begins to feel not like a choice, but like a constraint, an ill-fitting corset ribbed with the ossified sensibility of a former self. Joan Didion may be right. We are well advised to keep on nodding terms with the people we used to be, whether we find them attractive or not. But we are also well advised to welcome with a large-hearted embrace the blooming possibilities within us, the people we are in an ongoing course of becoming, the people we will have been when our atoms give way to our afterglow. Second reading is by Dr. Lucas D. Chalua. It takes courage and humility to acknowledge that one's previous position may have been flawed and to embrace the change that comes with growth. The beauty of human intellect lies in its capacity to evolve. Those who embrace change are destined to become the architects of progress. And the last reading by Becky Volmer. You are not intended to spend this life squeezed and choked and squashed in a vice of other people's design or values that aren't your own, or an outdated worldview. No. You were made for discernment and cultivation and expansion. And until you realize that the internal forces that guide you will evolve as you do, and that you have within you the power to shift and adapt them so that they may better meet your needs at various points in your life, trying to exist under the constraints of anything that doesn't fit will be a significant source of inner conflict. But when you understand that you are free to live by your rules, you also realize that you can rewrite them as needed. You can create an identity that is tailor-made, offered as wisdom for the journey.
Every walk in its light.
Every walk in its light.
Last week I talked about West Hill and about how it had evolved. I used one of the readings that talked about the importance of throwing yourself into something that you did not know, and as a way to grow beyond the constrictions that you have created around yourself. This week I want to continue that story because that's the process that you are in, a process that you started a couple of years ago with a visioning process facilitated by Joe Manifo, and then with these stages of different ways of coming together to do the work of bringing that into being. And so I stepped in as that process was unfolding. I stepped back in and wondered at your courage and your decisiveness and the choices that you make And I love that almost every time, as I began telling the story last week, almost every time you have been entirely to blame. It has never been me who has taken the blame of any change. Well, I've taken the blame, but I haven't been responsible for any of the changes that have taken place. So I want to take you a little further along that journey and speak about the readings that you've just heard and one or two of the quotes that were on the slides to get a sense of how you must continue going forward at this point in time, and the courage and excitement and joy that period of confusion may yet be. Some of our confusions are incredibly important times in our lives. Everything is mixed up to the point that we have to struggle to understand what on earth is going on, and out of that comes this new path or this new understanding or a new relationship or a new opportunity, and we find our way through confusion to a world that makes sense or may make sense for a period of time, but allows us to live fully. So I'm going to start with a bit of story about myself, as the focus moment suggested. I was born on July 6th, this Sunday. Any of you know that little rhyme? The child that's born on the Sabbath day is bonny and blithe and good and gay. I was all of those things. Not quite. But I was born on a Sunday, and I thought my second child was going to be born on a Sunday, but the kid just took so long that he ended up being a Monday child, full of grace, apparently. But I was given my grandmother's name. July 6th was the same birthday that I shared with my grandmother, Margaret Ann Grange Haycock. And she lived in Cataraqui. Her family had lived in the area for a couple of generations, very, very early people. And her birthday, being my birthday, I needed to get her name. So I was given the name Margaret Ann after her. Now that's not really a great story in my family, because her mother had promised her mother that she would name her first child after her. That was Martha Jane. And Martha Jane was born to my grandmother, a boy, and was given the name Martha Jane. And I don't think it really had anything to do with it, but he died a couple of days later. So that meant that my father's first child had to be named Martha Jane after his mother's mother. So my mother's first child had to be named Martha Jane. So her second child was going to be Janet Louise, which was a name that she loved. And I got born on my grandmother's birthday. So I got stuck with Margaret Ann. Now, I don't know how much of that is transferred when you're a baby, that ambivalence toward that name, but I never liked the name. I can remember as a very young child, my concept of it, and I don't know whether any of you ever walk through graveyards and think, oh, that's a pretty name, or, oh, look at that, isn't that a lovely old-fashioned name? I would imagine going through a graveyard and seeing the name Margaret and thinking, snooty, distant, angry. It just didn't suit. So I never liked it. I went as Margie. I was called Margie as I was growing up. When I got to high school, people started calling me Margie. So I started writing it with 2 G's, Margie. And then someone said to me, well, oh yeah, I know. The Margie is what goes into the carburetor and the Margie is what comes out. So it didn't help the way I felt about my name. I carried it, though, for many years. And then the first day of theological college, when the first day we're sitting around, we're introducing ourselves and name tags are handed out, and my name tag comes up and I write Greta on it. Lowercase. which I wrote, Margie was always lowercase as well. I wrote Greta on my name tag first day of theological college, and that's when I became Greta, which felt much better, you know. And in fact, you know, the reality is my grandmother, whose name was Margaret Ann, was known as Greta all her life. So like, what was I doing? But anyway, so I took her name on and I was Greta for many, many years. And the name Greta is attached to a lot of things. And Greta Vosper is a name that's attached to a lot of things. And so I actually, when I'm online, I use the name M. Kearns, E-M-M-E. I wrote poetry in university under the name M, short for M as in Margaret, but written out E-M-M-E. So I wrote poetry as that. So when I started being online, doing volunteer work for the World Bamboo Organization and things like that, I didn't want to sully their work with some of the stuff that the name Greta Vosper is sullied with. So I moved to M. Kearns, and that's the first name I've ever used with capital letters. Go figure. I don't know. I just write M. Kearns with capital letters. So why am I telling you all this? Because one of the things that I think West Hill has outgrown, as many of you know, is your name. You've outgrown your name. If you're going to pick up this piece of work that you handed to Joe Manifo in a bucket and said, make some sense out of this, and he gave you this to do in an international way, West Hill United Church doesn't really fit. The United Church came into being in 1925 because a bunch of other things didn't fit. The Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church and the, what was the other one? Congregationalists, thank you. None of them were really thriving, so they decided to come together. Half the Presbyterians didn't come, but they became the United Church of Canada. They needed a new moniker, a new name, a new identity to take them forward, so they had a new name. And when this church began in 1949, or it began in the 1940s, and then in 1949, it decided that West Hill Community Church was going to join the United Church, and so it needed a new name at that point in time. And in 1950, honestly, if we'd done it in 1949, this property would have been our own, but they waited until 1950, and then it became the United Church of Canada's property, so you know where that goes. But anyway, so they had to change their name again and became the West Hill United Church, which gave them an identity that grounded them in an understanding of the way that the United Church lived in this country, a progressive denomination bringing progressive understandings of theology and perspectives to the fore in this country, teaching its children, you know, radically progressive theology in its Sunday school, and its clergy even more progressive theology in its seminaries. And then we got caught, sort of, because we started to emerge beyond that a bit. Our story started to change. I talked about Vision Works, but I want to talk about some of the other things that happened too. Vision Works was one of the first things that happened, but some of the other ones, when people came to me and suggested that we do something about something, those moments were paralyzing. One of them was when the parents of the church school, we would have a children's time here at the front of the hall every Sunday, and at the end of that, the children would say the Lord's Prayer. And the parents came and said, we don't want our children saying that prayer because it does not reflect our beliefs. You're teaching them an understanding of God that we don't talk about up here. So why would we be teaching the children who go downstairs a different understanding? So we need something else. It took a year for me to actually step into that breach because that was terrifying for me, right? The idea of taking that iconic prayer and changing it was absolutely, heresy. But replacing it with something else was also challenging. Like it could have just slipped off the page, but people would have noticed. And so Scott began the process and we worked together. And over the course of Lent in 2004, we introduced a couple of lines every week just to hear how it sounded, the rhythm, and altered it based on the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, which wasn't ever written by St. Francis of Assisi, but ended up on a little card of his. That's all an aside. But based on that familiar prayer, and then we shifted it to reflect what our values were, and it became what we called the children's prayer, another name that eventually had to disappear because it was no longer valid. It wasn't just the children's prayer. It was a prayer that we use all the time. And then, after a while, when we stopped calling it the children's prayer, we had to stop calling it prayer. So we started calling it the words of commitment. And then, during the time that I was away, someone raised the fact that we're not talking about the environment. So the extra 2 lines were added to the beginning of it. We evolve our perspectives and how we do things. We do it as a community. You have always done it as a community. And often with me hanging on to your tails as you run forward going, oh my gosh, not this, not this. And you have made this incredible space. At one point, Dana Wilson-Lee was the chair of the board, and before her term ended, she wanted us to have an inclusivity statement related to the LGBTQ community. And so she brought that to the board and to the congregation. We began that discussion. 2 things happened. 2 people were extremely upset about that. One was a person who was gay and didn't want this to be a place that was politicized about his sexuality. He said, when I'm here, I'm just a guy. I don't want that to be me being here, being gay. So we had to deal with that reality. And the other one was someone who said, if you make a statement about that, I'm going to feel excluded because I'm here as someone who struggles with mental health issues. And if you're including that, you need to include me too. Like if you don't include me, I'll feel like if your inclusive statement is only about this particular group, where am I in that? So the statement had to go through many iterations to get to the point where it was open enough to be a true, non-exclusive statement in the way of West Hill United. Early in the 2000s, I began using an extra piece of reading during the Sundays, or the Sundays in the summer. And I would just added a secular reading, something from a book or something that I had found, and I would augment the scriptural passages with it. Reading it in this casual time when I didn't gown in that time. I normally wore a deep purple alb, and I stopped wearing that in the summer months. And those readings, they were good readings. They were based on whatever the scripture passages for that Sunday were, but I could pick up off them and talk about a more contemporary perspective on them if I used a contemporary reading that I could riff off. So I stopped using them the first summer. I just used them the summer after that. I just let them sort of bleed into the rest of the Sundays of the year. And I started using these passages from books and from the internet and from poetry and from movies and screenplays, and using them to help focus the point of the scripture over time. And then someone, chair of the Worship Elements Committee at the time, said, enough with the scripture already. Now, in the years leading up to that, you'll remember that the Bible used to sit on that huge marble communion table here at the front, those of you who were then here, on a brass holder. The minister who preceded me, the Bible used to be processed down the aisle every Sunday into the service and out of the service. And just a little bit before Bruce Sanguin left, he dropped it and broke the binding. So we couldn't process it anymore, which was an enormous relief to me, that we didn't have to carry it in and out. But it did sit on the table every Sunday. And each week, it would be opened to the lection of the day, the reading from Psalms of that day. And it was Jean Hamill who did that every Sunday. Well into our stopping the use of scripture, it was still up there, opened to Psalms. So I would take it after the service and I'd hide it somewhere in the building. And the next Sunday, Jean will have rooted it out, and there it was, back on the table. Until one day she says, "Why are we still doing this?" Right? Well, we don't need to do it, Jean. And we stopped putting it on the table. But the evolution of things happens over time. Music has always been an issue. It's something that lifts. It's an issue in church because it's an opportunity for us to feel like one. Music brings us together in a common bond as we sing together. So it's a very powerful piece within the religious community, whether it was, chants or early on, or whether it's singing evangelical choruses with our hands in the air now. It's a bonding experience, and it's emotional. But almost every song in the newest hymn book of the United Church, or the one that was new at that point, Voices United, there were about 12 to 20 songs, I think, that I felt comfortable singing and that I felt comfortable choosing for our services. So in 2004, when I was launching the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity, I said to Scott on the Wednesday night, I think it was, maybe Thursday, before the event, which was a Saturday night, Scott had written music for the evangelical community for years, since he was a child. He was writing music and songs, rewriting traditional tunes to more contemporary tunes for traditional songs. But growing up in an evangelical church, he had this bond of love with God that he expressed through the songs that he wrote. So when he went through that awakening moment of a social work degree, when he realized that his religion was just as much a construct as all the other religions that he critiqued, he was unable after that to write music. So on that Wednesday or Thursday, no time left to do anything, I said, "Oh, it would have been so nice if you could have written a song." Talk about manipulative. Well, it worked. By Saturday night, Scott had written an incredible song, which is still one of his most beautiful songs, and I can't remember the name of it right now. It is. What is it? The light of love. In the light of love, our lives have meaning. In the light of love, the spirit flies. Yeah, it's a beautiful song. And that kind of opened the floodgates, and within about 6 months, he had enough pieces of music to put in a songbook, and that's now used in many places across North America. And has written a second one, and I started rewriting words to traditional tunes because most congregations that were using our work still had organs and organists and needed to use traditional music. So I was rewriting the old stuff, and he was writing the new stuff. So all of these things happened over time. So why am I sharing all this, and where am I taking it? And it's not just about our name. It's about our change. It's about transformation. It's about breaking free of what we were. One of the quotes on the slide, I probably won't remember it, but it's something like, does someone really miss me if I'm not the person they think I am? Like are you missing someone who wasn't there? West Hill has this reputation in the United Church. We are this church that does these sort of things. And that reputation is not great. Over the course, for some, they think it's great, but for many people, we are causing a lot of friction. And I just want to remind you, it's not you that's causing the friction, it's those who created a rule to compromise leadership in the United Church. And so now others are wanting to use that rule to control leaders in the United Church of Canada. So there's a constant brewing of that. 3 petitions went to General Council this summer to require that clergy have to confess belief in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit literally every year. One of them was every year, one of them was regularly. The General Council chose not to use those, but it's based on the ruling that was made to try me about my beliefs. I don't know, maybe they thought it would never be used again, but they couldn't have thought that because that's illegal to create that kind of a rule. So now people are trying to use it. So West Hill, why was I saying that? Yes, our perspective, how we're seen within the United Church is as this anomaly. Some quietly admire what we're doing, but do it quietly because they don't want to come under scrutiny. But many just barely tolerate us in the United Church. Some of you will have been interviewed for an article that is in Broadview this month. The article was about the plan, and people who were interviewed talked about that plan at length. Mike Lowry is quoted, Gene Skillman is quoted, Debbie Ellis also gave a lot of information, a long interview to that. And they reached out to me for a photo, and I said, the article isn't about me, so I'm not sending it, please don't put a photo of me in. Well, there it is, a photo saying West Hill moves forward despite continuing tensions. So our perception in the United Church is being manipulated for a variety of reasons, but you get to own who you are. I don't care what people think about you. You get to own who you are. You have all along. You have created your story. You have found your ground. You have placed your feet upon it, and you have said, this is where I am, for about 10 minutes, and then you decide you want to do something else and you move, right? But that's your choice. You've made the choice to do that, and you've done it with courage and with clarity and boldly and without remorse. So going forward, how is it that we do this? How is the work that you do embraced with courage? And what is it that these readings that I shared with you from Maria Popova and the others, what do they have to do with that? So the first reading from Lucas Shalwa, who is a president and chancellor of a medical sciences university in the States, and also a public speaker. He talks about the courage and humility to acknowledge one's position, to own who you are, and then to go from there, and recognize that as we move forward, whenever we move forward, it's often because we recognize that there's a flaw or there's something wrong, that we no longer fit in those clothes, that we need to move. And we do that with, as I say, without remorse, because who you were on the way to here was who you were on the way to here. It's who you were, and you might have been stupid on occasion, you might have been wrong, you might have been bad. Who here wasn't bad? I mean, really. You could have made some drastic mistakes that cost you and the people around you a lot. But you're moving because that's who you were. And you learned from that, and you owned it, and you moved on. And if you have a therapist that's as good as mine, you can move on with courage and clarity, right? But you move on, and you as a community get to move on. And I'm taking you through a little bit of that therapy right now to remind you of your courage and your clarity of conviction and the work that you've done in the past so that you can do this work boldly. And you can do it well, as you always have. The second reading was from third reading was from Becky Vollmer. And I've already spoken to that one, so I'll leave that. But Maria Popova, I think I've talked to you about brain pickings before. She now calls it the marginalian, and she has, since she was a child, she wrote on the edges of books. She scribbled on everything. Marginalia is the stuff that's written, and who is it that will never write in a book? Any of you here won't ever write in a book? Oh, good. There's some freedom in writing in books. Just putting some little notes on the side. If Scott has a book with him now and he was to hold it up, you could probably hardly see the type for everything that he writes on the margins of his books. One of my theological professors loaned me Teilhard de Chardin's book, Mass on the, I can't remember what it's called, in my first year at theological college, and he had written notes in it, and each time he used a different color of ink. So there were at least 3 times that he had read through that whole book, the notes on the side not matching each other, getting something different out of it every single time, right? And Maria Popova has looked at all these notes, and she's created this story that she shares with the world from that marginalia that she has collected over time. And so her blog is called The Marginalian. And she writes in this reading today about what happens when when we create something over a long period of time, it gets an identity. And she had the identity on her blog. It was called Brain Pickings, right? Because she's like picking her brain for stuff about these things. But when she wrote this reading that was shared today, she was changing the name of her blog. So she was reflecting on what the cost of remaining within the same carapace was. If I remain within that same definition of who I have been, I'm circumscribing who I may yet be. And this is where we get to the name of West Hill United Church. Who are you? Who are you? I mean, you're barely United Church. You can ground yourself and say, we're United Church, darn you. But most people in the United Church wouldn't recognize this as a United Church. They may feel welcome when they came in here because there's nothing here that would make them feel unwelcome in terms of language. There's no symbols or things that we use that would make them feel excluded. The same as if someone from an evangelical Baptist congregation came into the space, they wouldn't feel, there's nothing that would exclude them. There may be things, as Scott often says, there's maybe things that they miss that aren't here, but nothing's going to tell them they don't belong. So do we have the courage to move beyond those words, United Church? Is it time? Is it not yet time? You get to figure that out. But you have to wrestle with it. And you can't just say, oh, no, we're not doing that. They're already angry enough with us. There's lots of United Churches that don't use the word United Church in their name. Lots of new congregations that have started up in the last 15 or 20 years that don't use United Church in their name. So brave the darkness, right? Get out there if you need to. And I've given you the story about how we became a United Church with property given to us by Mrs. Kennedy back in the 1940s. So we have walked with that with delight and courage, with presence, with engagement. We have been who we are, who you were, who you've evolved to be through all of that time. And look what's happened outside us. Like, this was a little tiny wooden church that unfortunately got buried in the parking lot when it was knocked down and this one was done. I think Gary dug out the hole so that it would stop sinking. Thank you, Gary, for that. When the wood started to rot and the parking lot had a big hole in it. That little white church, I heard stories when I first got here of people who had become fast friends because they met each other while they were washing out the pit toilets in the previous church, and they bonded over that experience. We won't ask you to bond over anything like that, but now is the time. And Maria recognizes that when we define ourselves in a certain way and we build the reality of that over time, we become comfortable with it, but we're changing. At some point, that change is too big for where you were. You have to become something else. On the way in, Scott and I were talking about Mama Cass, who everyone will know, and how after she left the Mamas and the Papas, she wanted to get rid of that name. She couldn't stand that name. She wanted to be known as herself. That name was put upon her. She rolled with it. She went with it, but her own individual talents got lost behind that story of who she was. So she worked hard, and in the last year or two of her life, she worked hard to create a presence and to give us songs that we still sing because they came out of her individuality rather than as her voice in a lineup. So I'm going to leave you with that. It's your work to do. I just want you to have fun while you're doing it. I want you to be scared half to death. I want you to dream, and then I want you to think, no, I can't do that. And then I want you to wonder, what about this, though? What about that? Could we? Oh, no. Are you crazy? Actually, that's a crazy good idea. You've got it before you. And you have a world that actually needs what you're doing. And while most of us are well over that hill, as I said last week, there's a world that desperately needs to remember that values are valuable, and living by them takes courage and commitment. And you have proven that over these past 70 some odd years. Thank you.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.